Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is say yes to something that feels safe. She thought she was pretending for a moment, but the moment became everything. Ladies and gentlemen, every choice we make has a story behind it, and hers began in desperation. Life had cornered her into a place where every door seemed to close before she could reach it. Bills stacked like enemies, dreams crumbling beneath the weight of reality, and a loneliness that wrapped around her like a cold fog. She was the kind of woman who gave everything and received nothing in return. Her trust, her time, her heart, all taken and broken in equal measure. So when the world gave her one last cruel reminder of how powerless she was, a notice of eviction and a job lost in the same week, she didn't cry. She just stood there, staring at her reflection, wondering how long a person could keep pretending they were fine. That's when fate decided to play its most dangerous card. It happened in the kind of place she never belonged, a glittering charity gala under crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen stars. She wasn't supposed to be there. A friend had dragged her along, promising free food and a chance to breathe the same air as money. She wore a borrowed dress, her confidence stitched together by sheer willpower. Around her, the air smelled of expensive perfume and ambition. Laughter echoed like music, but hers stayed locked behind polite smiles. And then, in a single heartbeat, everything changed. Because across that room stood a man whose very presence made the air still. The billionaire everyone whispered about. The man who owned half the city and seemed to feel nothing for it. He noticed her. Not because she was glamorous or loud, but because she was real. In a sea of perfect masks, her honesty was chaos. She wasn't trying to impress, she was trying to survive. When their eyes met, it wasn't attraction that struck first, it was recognition. Two people who, for entirely different reasons, were equally alone. Then, as if drawn by invisible threads, he crossed the room, his voice low and sharp like silk when he whispered, "Pretend you're with me." No explanation. No warning. Just a command wrapped in desperation. Before she could question him, flashbulbs went off. Cameras turned. The press leaned in like hungry wolves. In that moment, she realized he wasn't asking for affection. He was asking for rescue. His enemies were in that room, watching, waiting for a weakness to exploit. And she, by some twist of fate, had just become his shield. She slipped her hand into his, heart racing, face steady. They stood together, a picture of poise and perfection, the world spinning stories around them. And though she didn't understand it then, that one act of pretense would rewrite her entire life. After the gala, he found her again. The man behind the mask. His name, Alexander Cross, was colder up close, and yet, beneath that calm exterior, there was something else he feared. He didn't apologize, he didn't explain. Instead, he offered her a deal. A month, 30 days of pretending to be his partner. To the public, to the press, to everyone watching his empire. In exchange, her debts would disappear, her problems would be solved. "All you have to do," he said, "stand by me, pretend you belong." It was madness, it was dangerous. And yet, it was tempting. Not just for the money, but for what it represented, a way out. She wanted to say no. She wanted to walk away and prove that she was stronger than circumstance. But sometimes pride doesn't fill an empty stomach. Sometimes dignity has to make room for survival. And so, with a trembling hand and a racing heart, she signed the contract. That was the moment the world stopped being hers. The moment her life became his stage. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this wasn't just a deal of convenience. It was an invitation into a labyrinth of secrets, where love and danger would blur into one. Because Alexander Cross didn't just need a partner to fool the world, he needed someone to hide his truth behind. And so the pretense began. The cameras flashed. The world whispered. She became the woman everyone envied. Dressed in silk, photographed by magazines, draped in jewels that didn't belong to her. But beneath it all, she was still the same girl who once counted coins at the bus stop. Every morning she woke beside him, pretending to love him for show. She wondered who was really pretending, her or him, because there was something in his eyes, a shadow, a sadness, a secret, that told her this arrangement was never just about saving face, it was about saving himself. They were two people bound by lies, walking hand in hand beneath the blinding lights of truth. She had entered the deal to survive, but each passing day made her realize survival was no longer enough. She wanted to understand him. To see the man behind the billionaire, behind the whispers, behind that one sentence that changed everything. And as the days turned to weeks, she began to wonder when he whispered, "Pretend you're with me." Had he been asking for help, or warning her to run. It is said that the richest people are often the loneliest, and no one embodied that truth more than Alexander Cross. To the world, he was perfection wrapped in a tailored suit, the kind of man who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, whose name alone could make markets tremble. His photographs appeared on magazine covers beside headlines that praised his genius and envied his power. Yet beneath that flawless surface was a man carved by loss, molded by pain, and guarded by a silence so thick that even his wealth could not break it. She saw it first in his eyes, that cold flicker of distance every time the cameras turned away. The kind of look that said, "I've been everywhere, I've had everything, and none of it matters anymore." At first, he played his role flawlessly. Every dinner, every event, every choreographed moment of affection was executed with precision. He knew how to smile just enough to convince the public he was in love, but not enough to let her believe it. To her, he was a puzzle, one with missing pieces and sharp edges. Yet, as days turned to nights, she began to notice things the world didn't see. The way he clenched his jaw before walking into a crowded room, as if bracing for battle. The subtle tremor in his hand when he held a glass of champagne. The tired sighs that slipped out when he thought no one was listening. These were not signs of power. They were signs of a man carrying something heavy, something hidden. She tried not to care. It wasn't her place to. After all, she was just a woman playing a part, a temporary fixture in a life that wasn't hers. But curiosity has a way of disobeying contracts. It was during one of those endless charity events, beneath 1,000 artificial lights, that she finally saw him falter. A man from his past had approached. Older, crueler eyes filled with something like triumph. Alexander's mask slipped for only a moment, but in that second, his entire facade cracked. His smile vanished, his grip on her hand tightened until it hurt, and there was fear, unmistakable fear, in the eyes of a man the world believed was fearless. That night, she found him alone on the balcony, the city lights flickering like dying stars behind him. The wind whipped around his face, but he didn't move. When she spoke, he didn't answer. Only when she turned to leave did he whisper a name, soft, broken, trembling. It wasn't hers. It wasn't anyone she knew. But the way he said it made her heart ache. It was as if that name was the ghost that lived behind every decision he made, every wall he built, every smile he faked. She didn't ask who it was. She didn't need to. Some pain doesn't need explanations, it just needs space to breathe. From that night onward, she saw him differently. She began to realize that Alexander's world wasn't made of gold and glass. It was made of ghosts and guilt. He wasn't arrogant, he was guarded. He didn't isolate himself because he wanted to. He did it because every person who got too close ended up wounded. She noticed the empty picture frame on his desk, the locked drawer he never opened, the way his expression softened whenever he watched the rain fall. Slowly, the man she thought was heartless began to look more human, and that scared her more than his power ever did. Because when a man like him starts to seem human, it becomes dangerously easy to forget the lines, the ones between what's real and what's not. But Alexander was not ready to be seen. Every time she got close, he retreated deeper into his fortress of control. He distracted himself with meetings, surrounded himself with people who worshipped his success, yet trusted none of them. He believed that showing emotion was weakness, that vulnerability would destroy the empire he'd built. And still, she saw through it all, because no matter how much armor a man wears, his eyes will always betray him. In Alexander's eyes, she saw two wars, one against the world and one against himself. She began to wonder what it would take to reach him, to touch the part of him that still remembered how to feel. And though she didn't realize it yet, the moment she began to care was the moment everything changed. Because love, even when unspoken, has a way of peeling away the strongest masks. And soon, she would discover that behind his carefully constructed persona lay not just pain, but a dark secret powerful enough to destroy everything they had built, real or pretend. There comes a moment when every line between what's real and what's not begins to fade, when pretending becomes feeling, and feeling becomes a threat. For her, that moment crept in quietly, disguised as routine. Each morning she would wake in the same penthouse bed, sunlight pouring across sheets that smelled faintly of cedar and his cologne. At first it was mechanical. She knew the rules of the arrangement. How to smile at him in front of the staff, how to stand beside him at press events, how to hold his hand long enough for the cameras to capture a perfect frame. It was a performance, scripted and practiced. But as days turned into weeks, the act began to dissolve. Because when a lie is lived long enough, it starts to feel like the truth. He was careful at first. Every conversation was calculated, every glance a test of distance. But beneath his calm exterior, something was shifting. There were moments when their rehearsed smiles lingered a second too long, times when his hand would find hers without needing an audience. And slowly she realized, Alexander Cross, the man who prided himself on control, was losing his grip. The chemistry between them wasn't written in the contract, but it was there, undeniable, electric, and dangerous. It wasn't the kind of desire born from attraction. It was born from recognition. Two broken souls seeing their reflections in each other and finding comfort in the familiar darkness. Still, she tried to remind herself that it was only temporary. She told herself that feelings were not part of the deal. That what she felt in those moments when he looked at her, as if she were the only thing anchoring him to the world, was just imagination. But the heart doesn't care for logic, and the mind cannot unfeel what the soul has already accepted. Soon, she found herself laughing at his rare jokes, memorizing the sound of his footsteps, craving his presence when he wasn't near. She had fallen into the most dangerous trap of all, loving a man who had only hired her to pretend. The danger, however, didn't only lie in her emotions. It lurked in the people watching them. The media had started to take notice of how convincing their act was. Too convincing. Headlines speculated about wedding bells and whispered about a mystery woman who tamed the billionaire. The board of directors began to see her as a threat, a distraction that could ruin his focus. And then there was the man from Alexander's past, the one who had unsettled him at the gala, who started appearing again, shadowing their steps, feeding rumors to the press. Every time their faces appeared on the front page, the stakes grew higher. Every kiss staged for publicity became an invitation for scrutiny. Every smile hid 1,000 fears. The pretense was consuming them. Nights became quieter, heavier. Alexander started locking his office door. He'd vanish for hours, leaving her to wander the cold halls of his mansion, surrounded by silence that echoed too loudly. Sometimes she would catch him staring out the window, his reflection hard and distant, as if he was bracing himself for something inevitable. When she asked if he was all right, his answer was always the same, a hollow, "I'm fine." But she knew he wasn't. She could feel the tension in the air, the storm building just beneath his calm. It was as if the weight of his secret, the one he refused to speak of, was pressing harder every day. Then came the night that changed everything. A charity auction, elegant, extravagant, and yet suffocatingly tense. She could sense something was wrong the moment they arrived. He was different, quieter, distracted, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting a ghost. When a man in a dark suit approached and murmured something in his ear, his entire body stiffened. He turned pale, excused himself, and disappeared into the crowd. She followed, her heels clicking across marble floors, her pulse pounding with dread. In that moment, the cameras, the people, the lies, all of it fell away. Because what she found wasn't the man she pretended to love, or the billionaire the world worshipped. It was a terrified soul cornered by his past. That night shattered the illusion completely. The game they had been playing was no longer about power or pretense. It had turned into survival. Whatever secret Alexander was hiding was starting to surface, and she realized with growing fear that she wasn't just a bystander in his story anymore. She was a part of it, tangled in it. And if his truth came to light, it wouldn't just destroy him. It would destroy her too. And yet, even in that danger, she couldn't walk away. Because love, once awakened, doesn't retreat at the sight of shadows. It steps closer, even when it knows the dark might swallow it whole. Secrets have a way of breathing, quiet at first, almost invisible, until the silence becomes deafening. For weeks, she had sensed it. That invisible presence between them, the ghost that haunted his every word, every hesitation. She knew he was hiding something bigger than pride or pain. It wasn't just guilt, it was grief, heavy and poisonous. He had become a master at burying it under charm and power. But the truth has claws, and it was beginning to tear through the surface. The night of the charity auction had left a mark. The whispers, the pale look in his eyes, the man who had confronted him, all of it pointed to a story buried deep in his past. And like every story worth telling, it began with love and ended with loss. One stormy evening, when the city outside their penthouse windows was drowning in rain, she found him again on the balcony, the same place where his silence always spoke louder than his words. He stood there soaked to the skin, his glass of whiskey untouched, his eyes staring into the lightning-lit sky. She called his name softly, afraid to break whatever fragile thread held him together. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then he turned, and in that single glance, she saw something she had never seen before: surrender. The kind that comes from years of pretending everything is fine when it isn't. And for the first time, he spoke not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man unraveling at the seams. He told her about the woman before her, the one whose name he whispered in his sleep, the one whose shadow lingered in every corner of his life. Her name was Alina. She had been his fiancée, his first love, the light to his darkness. But success, he said, demands sacrifices, and he had made one too many. A business deal gone wrong, a betrayal inside his own company, a night that ended with twisted metal, shattered glass, and a siren that still echoed in his mind. Alina had died because of him, or so he believed. The accident had been ruled a malfunction, but Alexander knew the truth. It was his decision, his ambition, that had set the events in motion. And from that night onward, he stopped being a man and became a mask. She listened, frozen, her breath catching in her throat as his voice broke for the first time. This was the secret, the reason behind his coldness, his fear of love, his obsession with control. Everything he built, every calculated move, every perfectly placed lie, all of it was born from that guilt. He confessed that he had never forgiven himself, that every success felt like a punishment, not a reward. I tried to bury her with my past, he said, his voice raw. But every time I close my eyes, she's there, asking me why I lived when she didn't. He looked at her then, his eyes red and hollow. And you were supposed to be my distraction, my way of pretending I could still feel something. The words struck her like a blade. She had entered his world as a contract, but she had stayed because of the connection she thought was real. To hear that she had been nothing more than a bandage for his pain felt like betrayal. And yet, in his confession, there was honesty, a brutal kind she couldn't ignore. She realized that this wasn't manipulation, it was confession, the kind that doesn't seek forgiveness but simply wants to be heard. She could have walked away. She should have. But instead, she stepped forward, closing the space between them. Because beneath all his flaws, his guilt, his darkness, she saw a man begging to be human again. That night became their breaking point, and their beginning. She told him that guilt cannot undo the past, that living in penance doesn't bring back the dead. He didn't respond, but his silence said enough. When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away this time. The storm outside raged on, and for the first time, he let himself be vulnerable. He wept, quietly, painfully, for the first time in years. And in that moment, the man who once ruled empires was just a boy mourning the love he couldn't save. She held him, not as his pretend partner, not as his savior, but as someone who finally saw him, not for what he owned but for what he had lost. After that night, something changed between them. The air was different. He no longer wore the mask so tightly. He smiled sometimes, small real smiles that carried warmth instead of duty. But with the truth now uncovered, she also sensed danger circling closer, because secrets like his didn't stay buried without consequence. The man who had confronted him before, the one who knew more than he should, was back in the picture, threatening to expose everything. And for the first time, she understood what was truly at stake. This wasn't just about reputation or wealth anymore. It was about survival, of his name, his empire, and perhaps even his soul. Love is easy when the world isn't watching, but when it is, when the cameras flash, when enemies whisper, when the past lurks in every shadow, love becomes a battlefield. For Alexander and her, the battlefield had already been drawn. His secret had escaped the walls of silence, and the storm outside had finally found its way in. The man who knew the truth about the accident began leaking fragments of it to the press. Headlines hinting at corporate fraud, whispers of a cover-up, insinuations that Alexander Cross had blood on his hands. Overnight, the billionaire who once stood untouchable became a target. His board turned on him, investors withdrew, and the same media that once called him a visionary now called him a man built on lies. Through it all, she stayed beside him, not because she was obligated to, but because her heart refused to leave him broken and alone. He tried to send her away. He told her it wasn't her fight. He shouted, cursed, and begged her to walk out before she got dragged down with him. But she wouldn't. "You hired me to pretend," she said softly, "but I stopped pretending a long time ago." The words shattered him more than any accusation could, because love, real love, was something he didn't know how to accept. To him, it was a weapon, one that could hurt, destroy, and take everything from him again. So he did what wounded people do best. He built walls higher, sharper, and colder. Yet she kept breaking them down, quietly, gently, until he had nowhere left to hide. Days became an unending blur of crisis meetings and sleepless nights. He paced boardrooms while she waited outside, watching the empire he had built begin to crumble. There were times she doubted herself, times she wondered if she was strong enough to love a man who didn't believe he deserved redemption. But love, true love, isn't about certainty. It's about choosing someone even when logic tells you not to. And so she stayed. She brought him coffee when he forgot to eat. She reminded him to rest when his eyes burned from exhaustion. Sometimes, she would simply stand beside him in silence, her presence the only thing grounding him. Because sometimes, love isn't loud. It's quiet, it's endurance. And then, one night, when everything seemed to be falling apart, he broke again. He confessed that part of him wanted to let it all burn. To lose the company, the money, the reputation. Because he believed he didn't deserve any of it. Maybe this is justice, he said bitterly. Maybe this is what I owe. But she refused to let him drown in guilt. You owe no one your ruin, she said. You've punished yourself enough. Her words cracked something open in him, something buried beneath years of shame. For the first time, he looked at her not as a shield, not as a contract, but as the person who had quietly become his reason to keep fighting. In her eyes, he found something he thought he had lost, the possibility of forgiveness. But forgiveness, like love, comes with a cost. The man from his past, the one who had orchestrated the leaks, wanted more than revenge. He wanted Alexander destroyed, not just professionally but personally. One evening he appeared again, this time with an ultimatum, a file filled with proof that could ruin Alexander's life forever. Walk away from her, he warned, or I'll make sure she pays for your mistakes. It was blackmail, cruel, deliberate, and aimed straight at the only weakness Alexander had left her. That night he didn't come home. He disappeared into the chaos of the city, leaving her in a silence that felt colder than betrayal. She waited, hours turning into days, until she finally realized the truth. He hadn't abandoned her out of pride. He had done it out of love. When he finally returned, he was different, broken, hollow, but at peace in a way that terrified her. He confessed that he had signed away his control of the company, sacrificed everything to protect her. I can live without money, he said quietly. I can live without my name. But I can't live knowing you were hurt because of me. She could barely speak, because in that moment, she saw what love against fear truly meant. It wasn't flowers or promises or perfect endings. It was sacrifice. It was choosing someone even when it cost you everything. And though the world outside still saw a fallen billionaire, she saw a man who had finally learned what it meant to love without control, without fear, without pretense. For the first time, she wasn't pretending either. There are love stories that begin with honesty, and there are love stories that begin with lies. Theirs began with a contract, a promise made in ink and sealed in pretense. But what neither of them expected was that the lie would become the truest thing they had ever known. After everything, the scandal, the loss, the sacrifice, they found themselves standing at the edge of something new. The company was gone. The empire had fallen. The world that once worshipped Alexander Cross now whispered his name with pity and scorn. And yet, for the first time, he looked free. The chains of guilt had fallen away, replaced by something fragile but beautiful, peace. She saw it in the way he smiled now, not as a weapon but as a gift. In the silence of their ruin, they found something more valuable than wealth, the truth of what they had become together. Life slowed after that. No more galas, no more cameras, no more pretending to be perfect. They moved into a smaller place, a quiet home overlooking the river, far from the city lights that once defined them. He spent mornings reading, learning to cook, rediscovering the rhythm of a life he had long forgotten. And she finally breathed. No longer the woman trapped by debt or pretense. She worked at a local gallery, painting again, smiling again, living again. Sometimes they would meet for lunch at the small cafe down the street, just two ordinary people sharing soup and secrets. The world might have called it a fall from grace, but to them, it felt like rising from the ashes. Because sometimes, losing everything means finding what truly matters. But even in peace, the past has a way of whispering. There were nights when she'd wake to find him staring out the window, lost in thought, the ghost of Alina still flickering somewhere in his eyes. He never spoke of her anymore, but she could feel when the memories came, silent storms passing behind his calm expression. One night she told him gently, "You can't erase her. You don't have to. And for the first time, he nodded. Because love doesn't replace love, it expands it. He had learned that lesson through pain, through loss, through her. She wasn't there to heal him. She was there to remind him that he could heal himself. Their love was not the kind sung about in songs or written in fairy tales. It was quieter, slower, real. There were arguments, about bills, about the future, about fears neither of them could name. There were days when he withdrew into silence, and she had to remind herself that patience was the price of loving someone broken. But there were also mornings filled with laughter, with burnt toast and sunlight spilling across the kitchen floor. There were moments when he would touch her face as though she were something sacred. Not because of what she did for him, but because she stayed when the world left, and that was enough. Then came the anniversary of the night they met. The night he whispered those fateful words, "Pretend you're with me." They hadn't planned to celebrate, but fate, it seemed, had its own sense of poetry. He surprised her with a small dinner at home, candles flickering softly, music low. As they ate, memories returned. The chaos, the fear, the uncertainty of that night. "Do you ever think?" she asked, smiling wistfully. "How strange it is that all of this started with a lie." He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," he said quietly, "because that lie led me to the only truth I've ever known." And then, just as he had years ago, he stood, crossed the room, and whispered again, "Pretend you're with me." She laughed, a soft, disbelieving sound, because she finally understood what he meant. He wasn't asking her to fake it anymore. He was remembering the words that began their story, not as deception but as destiny. This time, she rose to meet him, her hand finding his, her heart steady. "We don't have to pretend anymore," she whispered back. And in that moment, the world, all its chaos, its pain, its noise, seemed to disappear. It was just them, standing in the same place they once stood as strangers, but now as two souls who had walked through fire and come out whole. The pretense was over. The story that began as fiction had become something real, something lasting. Because sometimes the lies we tell to survive become the truths that set us free. And sometimes, pretending to love someone is the only way to discover you already do. Some stories don't begin with a kiss or a promise. They begin with a lie, a moment of fear, or a desperate whisper in the dark. "Pretend you're with me," he said once, not knowing those words would change both their lives. What began as a performance became a revelation, that love, in its truest form, doesn't need perfection, or wealth, or even certainty. It simply needs two hearts brave enough to stay when everything else falls apart. She walked into his world as a stranger, wearing borrowed confidence and borrowed dreams, but she left it as the one person who taught him how to live again. And he, the man who had built walls high enough to touch the sky, finally learned that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the purest kind of strength. Together, they discovered that the greatest truth love can offer isn't found in fairy tales or fantasies, but in the courage to face each other, flaws and all, and say, "I'm not pretending anymore." So tonight, remember this. Sometimes the greatest stories are born from the most unexpected lies. Sometimes the act of pretending becomes the doorway to truth. And sometimes, the person you least expect to save you does, not because you asked, but because they saw you when no one else did. Because in the end, love isn't about pretending to be someone else. It's about finally becoming who you were meant to be.